Are you looking for a Bible study that goes verse by verse, also gives you historical context, and gives you personal insights that can help you with your walk with God? If that's what you're looking for, join me in my Bible study through the book of John. Today we're going to be going through John 2, 1 through 12. Hi, I'm Vanessa. Welcome to my channel, Wholeheartedness Podcast. Today I'm going to read through the entire text that we're going to be talking about today, and then we'll go verse by verse. So John 2, 1. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. So on the third day, a wedding took place at Cana, not sure, in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine. Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. That is big. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them up to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days. Let's get into this. So starting in verse 1 and 2. So on the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. It's been taken that it's literally like 3 consecutive days, and others have seen it as on the third day, meaning 3 days later. So like on the third day, 2 days, full days have passed from chapter 1, and then on the third day. So either way. But I thought it was interesting. If it is 3 consecutive days, there's something about 3. I don't know why in the Bible there's a lot of numbers that keep showing up. I don't have any theories of why that is, but here, if it is consecutive days, I just find it interesting that on the third day after Jesus is revealed as the Messiah, he starts his miracles. Another thing that's interesting to note in verse 1 is that it only mentions Mary, Jesus' mother, earthly mother, which gives us a sign that at this point, which Jesus is about 30 years old, his father, Joseph, is presumed to be dead. Because if he wasn't dead, we could assume that he would have been with them, but he's not named. He's not named anywhere else in the Gospels after Jesus' ministry starts. So we can assume that he had passed away by this time. And then in verse 3, when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." And that might not seem like a big deal, but for them in their ancient culture, that was actually a pretty big deal. It was seen as almost like dishonoring and disrespectful to your guests at your wedding or your party if you did not have enough food and drink to sustain them for the duration of your party. And they took it so seriously. It really gets intense. They took it so seriously that if you invited them to your party and you did not have enough food or drink to sustain them through your party, it would be a disgrace and a shame that would be held over your head potentially for the rest of your life. The way they saw things were so intense when it came to these parties that someone could even sue someone. I read this online that someone could even sue someone for not getting an adequate wedding gift. So clearly these people were not playing when it came to their parties. And for me as a 21st century person who had a wedding, mistake number 1, I had the ceremony and the reception in 2 different places. Bad idea. Mistake number 2, I decided to take my wedding photos in between. And so the distance between the 2 was 20 minutes, and we decided to take the pictures in the first location. Mistake number 3. And I get a call from my mother telling me, "Vanessa, there's no more food. People are hungry, and the DJ's not playing any music." Why my mother would do that to me on my wedding day, I don't know. And here I was, still in the first city, 20 minutes away. We're not done taking pictures, and I'm getting called with this information. So if I lived back in ancient Jewish times, I would have been disgraced for the rest of my life. People would have been like, there goes that girl who made us go hungry. Rude. And I would be like, dang, y'all ain't got no grace. Y'all ain't got no understanding. But something to notate is the fact that they ran out of wine could speak to their financial status, the bride and the groom. Perhaps they were poor, and them running out of wine before the wedding was even over was perhaps evidence of that. So after Mary brings this no more wine issue to Jesus, he says, "Woman, why do you involve me?" And I totally am joking with that because back then, calling a woman was not disrespectful. It was actually a respectful way to address someone. But what is odd is that he's calling his mother, his earthly mother, woman, rather than calling her mother. Many biblical scholars propose that perhaps he was kind of separating himself from her and redefining their relationship at the start of his ministry. And I kind of agree with that because we definitely see that echoed and that same thing kind of repeated at Jesus's crucifixion. And so Jesus replies, "My hour has not yet come." I have always equated this statement as Jesus kind of alluding to his crucifixion and his death that's coming. Other people have seen this statement to mean that he was telling her, my time's not come yet to start performing miracles. But the reason why I don't really side with that is because it's clear throughout the Gospels that Jesus had some understanding of what was coming. He had some foreknowledge of the future, if not having full context and understanding of the future. And so for me, it would be weird that he's telling her, my time has not come yet to start miracles, and yet in a moment we're going to see that he does a miracle. And so it would just show that he doesn't understand what's coming, and he had a misunderstanding in that moment of what was supposed to happen. And I don't agree with that because, again, throughout scripture, we see that Jesus had some foreknowledge of what was coming. My personal take on it, you can tell me in the comments what you think about that statement. And then in verse 5, Mary tells the servants to do whatever Jesus tells them. It's kind of echoing the call of the Christian, she's talking to servants here, and we're called to serve the Lord. And then in verse 6, it says, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. That's a whole lot. I'm just thinking about the gallon of milk in my fridge. Imagining 20 to 30 of those. Those were some pretty large jars, and there were 6 of them. It's pretty intense. When I first read this, I was curious to know. It says that these jars were for ceremonial washing, and I was wondering if there was any significance to that, and so I looked into it. And it was pretty interesting what some people had to say, because the ceremonial jars are associated to the law of the Old Testament. It was something that was used in order to obey things from the Old Testament that God had commanded. And I was reading online that some people equate these jars as representing the law, and Jesus turning the water into wine, as we'll see, alluding to the new covenant. So the jars with water representing the old covenant that we find in the Old Testament between God and the Israelites, and then the water being turned to wine in the New Testament, representing the new covenant in Christ. And so it's not different. It's not like there was one content in there and they emptied it out and then added new contents to it, but rather the water turned into the wine. The wine came from the water. The new covenant is essentially defining what the old covenant always was meant to be. And so I found that pretty profound. So in verse 7, Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, these 6 20 to 30 gallon jars. So they filled them to the brim. So these servants do what they're asked to do. I find this really interesting because Jesus is about to perform a miracle here. So clearly he's capable of doing it himself. He could have just probably willed it with his mind that these 6 jars are filled with water. And the amount of time it would have taken for them to fill 6 jars that are 20 to 30 gallons each with water probably took a long time. So he made the guests of the wedding patiently wait for the wine and perhaps even anticipate, like, did they run out of wine? Am I going to have to shame these people for the rest of their lives as they wait for 6 20 to 30 gallon jars to be filled with water? Unless they had some like spout that was just bursting out some water. it probably took a while. And so instead of Jesus just willing water in the jars, he asked them to fill it. And I thought that was really profound. There's so many really profound things going on in these 12 verses, because what he's asking these servants to do is to participate with him in this miracle he's about to do. I see it like our relationship with God. He could literally do everything without us. He could save people without our participation. He could change situations without our participation, whether it be through prayer, word, or deed. He invites us in to what he's doing, and he allows us to be participants with him. We plant seeds and he grows those seeds. We bring him water and he turns it into something amazing. And it just shows that he is a relational God. He wants to engage with us. Things that he could just do on his own, he's decided and made it so that we would participate with him. And another thing, like this whole verse and this whole section is just filled with so many nuggets. But another thing, of all places God decided to have Jesus do his first miracle was at a party where the appropriate people to ask for help were servants. And so these servants were the lowest members at this party. They were at the bottom of the totem pole. And of all people, Jesus asked to help him with his first miracle. He asked the servants. And again, the situation was relevant for him to ask the servants. God created the situation intentionally so that the first people he would ask to engage with him in something so amazing would be servants. And because of that, they were elevated to, it's like the last will be first and the first will be last. They were the lowest at this party, and yet they got to be elevated to, I assume, to become children of God in that moment. They got to see this miracle, which I only can imagine led to a belief and a faith in him that changed their life forever. Something I read from Charles Spurgeon about this incident where these servants filled the jars to the full. It was a very beautiful quote. He said, when Jesus asks us to believe in him to the brim. When you're told to love him to the brim. When you're commanded to serve him to the brim. Essentially to say, do everything for God all the way. Bring your whole heart to the table. Don't follow God half-heartedly, but give God all of you to the brim of who you are. And then in verse 8, Jesus tells them, now draw some out, take it to the master of the banquet. So the master of the banquet here was essentially the head server. So he was running the show. Essentially, he was the servant's boss. This position would also be considered the master of the ceremony. So they were kind of like the wedding planner in a way, where they're like managing all the moving parts, making sure everything's going fine, overseeing the food, overseeing the wine, making sure that everything's going smoothly and to order. So now these servants, one, obediently filled up these jars and to the brim. And so they know, because they filled them up themselves, they know that inside of these jars is water. And so when they pour out this liquid into a cup to bring it to the master of the feast, it's water. And they see that it's water. And so just imagine you're them, and the master of the feast is aware we've run out of wine, and you've been told to fill up jars, and you know it's just water in them. And then you're told to pour some out into a cup and to bring it to your boss and let him taste it. It's like, either this is like you're asking me to do a really bad joke that could cost me my job and my livelihood. And yet what do? It says they did so. So they did. They did what Jesus told them to do. I really feel like this is like a huge display of faith. There perhaps was something about Jesus that they saw that made them listen to him. Because if you think about it, he was just a guest at the wedding. He wasn't the bridegroom. He wasn't the one running the wedding. He was just a guest. He was invited. And up to that point, he was just a normal guy, unless they had heard what John the Baptist said. But he was out in the wilderness. He was on the edges of town. And so perhaps they had heard. And they're like, all right, let's see what this guy's got. Let's see what he does. But nonetheless, following Jesus's order had risk, and yet they were willing to take that risk. I assume, I have no idea though, perhaps back then you had servants just had to listen to everyone and were subject to everyone's demands. Who knows? But I assume the only people they would have had to answer to in regard to like the back end stuff, like the food and the drinks, would have been the master of the feast. But this guest telling you what to do, taking up so much of your time to fill up gallons and gallons of jars of water, and then they're telling you to fill up a cup and take it to your boss to drink it. Like, what they're doing is pretty amazing. It's pretty intense, having no idea how he's going to resolve this issue, but yet trusting him enough to take this risk. Like, they had to have some faith in him. There was something about him, something he said, that really drew them to him, to trust him and to go ahead and do what he said. And then in verse 9, the master of the banquet tastes the water, which had turned into wine. So I'm assuming as they're walking it to the master of the feast, Jesus performs the miracle of turning this water into wine. Now, a lot of people are like, make a big deal about Jesus turning water into wine. Like, oh, he made alcohol as his first miracle. But back then, from what we know, is that wine was a lot more diluted. It wasn't as strong and potent as it is today. But because Jesus made it, and it was a miracle, and it wasn't made through like usual means, we have really no idea. But we would assume that he created it similar to what they liked back then because of the master of the feast response in verse 10, where he says, "You saved the best for last." So clearly it was up to par with the type of wine they liked back then, which was diluted. So we can assume the wine was diluted. It wasn't like 18% alcohol or anything. But the point is that Jesus turns the water into wine, which is outside of nature. It doesn't, as far as I know, there's no way to turn water into wine. And even if there was, there would need to be a process. You don't just pour it in a glass and walk it a couple feet and suddenly it's wine. So this miracle that Jesus does shows that he is beyond the laws of nature. He is capable of doing anything. He's not bound by the laws and restrictions we have as humans. And something I really want to highlight here, again, we talked about the bride and groom and that there likely were a poor couple from the country, but something here that we could miss by not having that cultural context, that Jesus was essentially redeeming them by doing this to the water. Because if they did not have enough food and drink to supply for their guests, they would have potentially been shamed for the rest of their lives. So in doing this miracle and turning the water into wine, he spared them of shame. He took the shame from them that was really rightfully due. He redeemed the situation for them, and they probably didn't even know. And he turned their situation around. And that just makes me think, like, how many times does God do little miracles that perhaps we will never know until heaven? Ways where he spares our life, or he spares us some kind of suffering or some kind of shame. And we don't even realize it because it's all happening behind the scenes and we don't have a vantage point there, but he does. And it just makes me think of that, because the bride and groom, as far as we know, at least from what we're told, they weren't told that they ran out of wine. And so this miracle spared them of a life of potential misery, and they didn't even know it. And in verse 10, the master of the feast says, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best until now. If I'm understanding correctly where they're at in the timeline of their party, it's at a point where guests have already had a lot to drink, and the likelihood of them finishing gallons and gallons of wine is unlikely. So they probably would have been left with a lot of leftover wine, and they could have likely even sold that wine after this to make an income. So not only did Jesus save them from shame, he is potentially also providing for them. And so everything God does, it's not a one-dimensional thing. There are multifaceted meanings and purposes behind everything Jesus does. To us, there's always like one or two apparent reasons why something happens, but there's often so many other things that flow from one incident. And sometimes it takes years for us to look back and see, like, whoa, this would have never happened had that not happened. And I thought that happened for this reason. And perhaps it did happen for that reason, but it's also affecting me in this way. It's benefiting me in this way. And so I think this is no different. Jesus was performing a miracle, which in a sense was confirming his messianic title. And so he not only produced wine, but he produced faith in these servants who he had participate with him in this miracle. He potentially is providing income for the bride and groom. He is removing shame from them that they would have otherwise experienced. Him turning water into wine is showing he has power that goes beyond the laws of nature that bind us here. Even perhaps for Mary, his earthly mother, it was a redeeming act too, because again, this is a culture that really has a lot of shame tied to different things. And she was a single young woman. Through the miraculous conception, she became pregnant with Jesus. And it seems in ancient culture, those types of things aren't forgotten. Those are kind of held over your head, and you have that label slapped on you, what sounds like for the rest of your life. If your party doesn't provide enough drink or food, they might shame you for the rest of your life for that. So imagine the kind of shame that might come on a woman who is young and not married. And so Jesus doing this miraculous act and all that he was going to do moving forward, perhaps it was somewhat of a redemption for her to show that what she might have claimed or what happened to her with becoming pregnant with Jesus was legitimate. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory. So it was through his miracles that Jesus was revealing to the world his glory and the legitimacy of who he said he was. And his disciples believed in him. I believe his disciples already believed in him. So I believe the statement is simply saying that it made them believe all the more, like their belief overflowed from seeing Jesus do these things. And then after this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. People believe the term brothers here is talking about, could be considered his cousins, or it could be his literal siblings that Joseph and Mary had, because Jesus was the firstborn of the family, and we know that they had other children after Jesus. And so they stayed in Capernaum for a few days. I don't know about you, but I felt like Scripture is just coming alive. There is so much goodness and so much context to be gleaned from every single word, things that we might overlook. There are practical insights, there are historical contexts that add just flavor and dimension to God's word. If anything I said really spoke to you, I would love to hear it in the comment section. If you have any questions, I would love to hear it. And my hope is to eventually start doing some Q&As by receiving questions, whether in the comment section or via my email. But thank you so much for being here. I really, really appreciate all of you. So much love and hugs to you all. I pray this was a blessing to you today. Share it with whoever you think might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you want to follow along for more Bible studies and more challenging content, because here on Wholeheartedness, no topic is off topic. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.